I think we're looking at the long-lost tomb of Alexander the Great.
Finding the tomb of Alexander is the dream of every archaeologist, and after decades, an archaeologist believes she has discovered the tomb of Alexander the Great, the location of which had been a mystery for centuries. So, over 2,000 years after his death, has the tomb of Alexander the Great finally been found? Join us as we explore the mysteries surrounding the tomb of Alexander the Great and the enigmatic connection to his burial wishes. The tomb of Alexander has been found. In June of 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. His sudden death before his 33rd birthday has long been a point of speculation. Was it disease, old wounds, or murder? These mysteries have followed scientists for centuries and have sparked immense curiosity among researchers. It wasn't until an archaeologist believed she had discovered the tomb of Alexander the Great that scientists had a basis to revisit the questions they had pondered in the past. Almost 2,150 years after his death, has the tomb of Alexander the Great finally been found. This is what Calliope Limnaeos Papacosta, a Greek archaeologist, claims. After several years of research in Alexandria, northern Egypt, she recently uncovered a statue and an ancient Roman road. Following further excavations, her team of researchers also discovered the foundations of a large building, which appears to be the former royal quarter, supposedly housing the tomb of the famous ruler. This find came as the result of extensive research. Calliope Limnaeos Papacosta has been studying the site for over 20 years. I have never seen anyone in my career who has stayed on the same site for 21 years, one of her associates told the American media. The excavation area is located on the site of the ancient city of Memphis, later integrated into the city of Alexandria during antiquity. Particularly exposed to natural phenomena, such as earthquakes and Nile floods, the site has suffered a lot of damage, forcing researchers to protect and clean the site regularly, further slowing down the research. It was the Ptolemies of Egypt who acquired his body and built him a tomb in Alexandria that became a landmark of the city for centuries. However, the conqueror's tomb mysteriously vanished from the historical record, and the quest to rediscover it has possessed countless people ever since. The loss of the tomb of Alexander the Great would have been caused by an earthquake. After his death in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of 32, the remains of the Macedonian king were moved to Alexandria around 280 BC, one of the many cities he founded during his reign. But in the year 365, the city was hit by numerous earthquakes and a tsunami. The population fled, and the sovereign's grave was likely buried and forgotten. But Calliope Limnaeos Papacosta was fully determined to find it. The Greek archaeologist spent years researching ancient tomes and maps of Alexandria to find the location of the tomb. Her teams also used tomography, a technique that scans the different layers of the ground to build a 3D image. Decades of research might have finally recovered the tomb of Alexander the Great. This is good news for Egypt. Indeed, this archaeological discovery would be a boon to the country's tourism. In addition to the forthcoming opening of the Great Egyptian Museum, the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities regularly shares the discoveries made by archaeologists. The death of Alexander. Alexander spent his days organizing the details of his Arabian expedition, but his nights were filled with banquets and drinking binges. One evening, he was invited to a party at the home of a friend, Marius of Thessaly, but after feeling a pain in his chest, he returned to his bed. Feeling feverish, his health quickly began to deteriorate, but he ignored both the pain and fever and continued working through the day and partying at night. After another night partying with Medius, he returned home. Still feeling feverish, the following morning, he made his usual sacrifices to the gods, although he had to be carried on a litter. Over the next few days, He continued his usual routine of sacrificing to the gods and holding meetings with his officers, believing he would soon recover. Arrian confirmed what was written in the royal diaries about Alexander's last days. He drank with Medius twice, but later took a bath, ate, and went straight to sleep with the fever already on him. Despite reassurances that he was still alive, the men believed him to already be dead, so they were permitted to file past him as he lay on his bed. The fever and pain continued to escalate, and eventually, he lost his ability to speak. As his condition grew desperate, he was moved to his palace. He recognized his officers when they entered his room but could no longer speak to them. On 10 June 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died. Alexander's forgotten Memphite tomb. Following Alexander's death, his powerful friends scrambled over the scraps of his empire. Eventually, they would tear it apart through decades of civil conflict and forge their own kingdoms. One of those friends, and the most relevant to the story, was Ptolemy Soter. Ptolemy was a relatively minor figure at court during Alexander's life. A long-term friend, but not a man who wielded much power. In the settlement forged after Alexander's death, Ptolemy was granted control of Egypt, where he planted his own Ptolemaic dynasty that would stand until Cleopatra's fatal alliance with Mark Antony almost 300 years later. Alexander's wishes for his own burial are unclear. His successor, Perdiccas, eventually chose to send him back to Macedon, but he never arrived. His funeral train departed Babylon in 321 BCE, but Ptolemy's forces appropriated the body in Syria and redirected it to Egypt. When Ptolemy stole Alexander's body, he was ruling from the city of Memphis. Alexandria was still being constructed, so Alexander was placed inside a temporary tomb near the city. Near the Serapeum of Saqqara, 19th century archaeologists found a temple of the pharaoh Nectanebo Tseku. Nectanebo was the last native pharaoh of Egypt who vanished after the Persian invasion in 340 BCE. Archaeologists such as Andrew Chugg have proposed that this temple of Nectanebo at Saqqara was Alexander's original Memphite tomb. The temple would only have been a few decades old when Ptolemy was searching for a burial place, and it was probably the most recent major non-Persian monument in Egypt, and therefore an ideal place to lay Alexander to rest. Throw in an unused royal sarcophagus for Nectanebo II, and Ptolemy had a perfectly prepared royal burial right next door to his seat of power that was perfect for Alexander's temporary interment. The discovery of statues dating from Ptolemy I's reign in the vicinity of this temple confirms that some royal attention was paid to this site at this time. Interestingly, an apocryphal ancient story claimed that Nectanebo fled to Macedon and was Alexander's true father. Modern historians acknowledge this story as nonsense. Alexander was almost certainly already born before Nectanebo fled Egypt, but the story might have emerged because of Alexander's burial in the former's tomb. After several years in Memphis, Alexander was moved to Alexandria by Ptolemy II. There was a lost second tomb in the city, but we know nothing about it, other than the fact it existed. It was Ptolemy IV who finally completed Alexander's third and most famous tomb, called the Soma. The Soma was a mausoleum built to house both Alexander and the Ptolemaic royal family. Ancient sources tell us that it stood at the crossroads between the city's main north-south and east-west road. The tomb served as a cult center of the deified Alexander through the 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Later, as the power of the Ptolemies declined, they pillaged the tomb for gold and treasures that could be melted down or sold to meet their needs. Julius Caesar visited the tomb in 48 BCE. Later, Cleopatra stripped the tomb of many of its remaining treasures to raise money for her and Mark Antony's doomed war effort against Octavian. After his victory, Octavian himself visited the tomb to pay tribute to Alexander. When asked if he wished to see the bodies of the Ptolemaic kings as well, Octavian replied, "I came to see a king, not corpses." The Soma was a landmark of the city, and its fame drew visitors from far and wide. That only makes its disappearance more peculiar. The last recorded visit to the tomb was in 215 CE, when the Roman Emperor Caracalla visited during his time in Egypt. Caracalla ordered some of the burial goods to be removed, but supposedly added some of his own gifts to the burial as compensation. After this, the tomb and Alexander's body are only referenced offhandedly. The writer Libanius offers out final mentions of Alexander's mummy still being on display just before 390 CE. The timeline of this final mention aligns with the Theodosian decrees between 389 and 391, where Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan temples across the empire. The tomb, being a cult center for the deified king, must have run afoul of these laws. St. Cyril of Alexander mentions that the cult centers of Alexander were stripped of their treasures on Theodosius's orders, although the tomb is not directly mentioned. Then, by the early 400s CE, St. John Chrysostom wrote that the locations of the body and tomb of Alexander had been lost. The trouble with tomb hunting. The hunt for the tomb poses many challenges. The fact that Alexandria is a bustling inhabited city is one, meaning that it is virtually impossible to excavate most of the area. The continual inhabitation of Alexandria also raises the possibility that the tomb has simply been destroyed and that there is nothing left to be found. Land subsidence and changing sea levels have also flooded many old areas of the city and may have damaged the tomb. There is also the question of whether Alexander will be found with his famous tomb. It is common for bodies to be moved long after their interment. Egypt itself has no shortage of examples in its other royal burials, and there is a chance that Alexander was taken out of the Soma and reburied somewhere else. While some archaeologists insist on searching for the Soma itself, the search for Alexander may yet be a different quest. Therefore, the search for Alexander's tomb can mean quite different things to different people. The obvious starting point is to find the old crossroads of Alexandria somewhere in the modern city. The current layout does not correspond to the old layout, with settlement patterns in Alexandria shifting significantly over time. Excavations under the authority of Mahmud Bey in 1895 provided some insight into the old layout and placed the crossroads somewhere in the vicinity of the intersection of the modern El Horeya and Nebi Daniel roads. While no reliable evidence of the actual tomb exists past the 4th century, several later writers claimed that the tomb of Alexander still existed in the city, although none of them described any tomb consistent with the ancient sources. More likely, local memory preserved the approximate location of Alexander's tomb, and over time, various places claimed to be atop the site or passed themselves off as the genuine tomb. Some proposed that Alexander's tomb and remains were rebranded as those of St. Mark to avoid persecution during the Theodosian decrees. It was these remains that Venetian merchants famously stole in 892 by smuggling them out of Alexandria in a shipment of pork. They were taken to Venice, where a church was built to house them on the site of the modern Basilica di San Marco. During work on the Venetian basilica in the 1960s, a curious piece of a stone relief carving was discovered. The type of stone was from the Eastern Mediterranean, and the artwork upon it was clearly Macedonian Greek, depicting a shield with the star of Alexander's royal house and a distinctive sarissa spear wielded by Alexander's armies. Recent studies of the relief concluded that it was part of the casing of a sarcophagus. However, its size did not match any sarcophagi in the basilica, nor any known Macedonian artifacts. Chugg noticed that it did match one specific sarcophagus, down to a matter of millimeters, that of Nectanebo II. They argue that this casing is proof that the tomb the Venetians stole from was actually that of Alexander the Great, and they took this chunk from the tomb. At the same time, they stole the body. A reconstruction of the tomb and body of Alexander the Great. According to Chugg's theory, Alexander was interred in the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II in Memphis when he was first brought to Egypt. Both man and sarcophagus were later moved to the Soma, whose ruins lie somewhere beneath the city, around the intersection of the El Horea and Nebi Daniel roads. The Ptolemies also constructed a suitable casing for his sarcophagus that would keep it safe for over 1,000 years. The tomb lay there for over 700 years until the Theodosian decrees forced it to be rebranded as a Christian monument of St. Mark to escape persecution from the authorities. Alexander's body vanished at the same time and place that Mark's appeared, and in spite of the next Mark story, local memory of Alexander's tomb being in the area also survived. Centuries later, the Venetians stole the body, believing it was that of their patron saint, and took with them a chunk of the sarcophagus's Ptolemaic casing. In Venice, the remains were venerated as the legitimate relics of St. Mark. Back in Alexandria, the now empty sarcophagus ended up in the Atarine Mosque, where it was correctly remembered to be part of Alexander's burial. In all likelihood, then, Alexander's famous tomb still lies beneath the streets near where local traditions and archaeological study have placed it. However, Alexander's body probably hasn't called it home for more than 1,000 years. The famous conqueror is quite likely lying inside the Basilica di San Marco, mistaken for a saint. Rumors of his death. Immediately after his death, rumors began to circulate that Alexander had not died of old wounds or a fever but was poisoned. However, these rumors soon subsided while the successors began to divide the empire among themselves. First, we must determine whether poison fits the symptoms of Alexander's fatal sickness. Given the sheer variety of deadly substances, it is easy to find several that might work. Scholars have suggested ergot, a fungus that grows on certain types of cereals and can produce symptoms of high fevers, coma, and death, as one potential poison, although it does not produce the same gradual decline in faculties observed in Alexander, nor the intense abdominal pain. Graham Phillips in Alexander the Great, Murder in Babylon, suggested strychnine poisoning, a relatively rare poison in the ancient world that might easily have gone unnoticed and was easily masked when mixed in with wine. However, strychnine does not typically cause fever and instead produces convulsions that are wholly absent from accounts of Alexander's death. Some proposed hellebore as the fatal culprit. This poisonous plant was well known to the Greeks and would have been mixed with wine, which is consistent with accounts that place his sudden illness after a night of drunken revelry. Hellebore also produced a more protracted poisoning than other substances, complete with a high fever and abdominal pain, although the gradual loss of speech and motor functions described in Alexander's death are not typical of this poison. The trouble with diagnosing a poison is that different people can manifest different symptoms. It's also possible that a concoction of multiple substances was used. Therefore, we cannot assert a single poison as the cause. However, every symptom of Alexander's illness could have been caused by one poison or another, so we cannot discount the poison argument either. The poison theory also depends on circumstantial evidence. Poison looks more likely when one considers how many people had the means or the motivation to eliminate Alexander. The obvious candidate who is named in both Plutarch and Curtius is Antipater. Antipater was an elder statesman and general who was entrusted with the governance of Macedonia and Greece in Alexander's absence. By controlling such an important part of the empire and being an experienced and respected leader in his own right, Antipater was the second most powerful person in Alexander's empire. Alexander's paranoia was well known. He had already eliminated another elder statesman, Parmenion, on specious pretenses a few years earlier, and Antipater would have recognized his precarious position. Furthermore, Antipater had two sons in close proximity to Alexander, Cassander and, crucially, Iollas, who served as Alexander's personal cupbearer. Diodorus, Quiritis, and several modern scholars have proposed that Antipater ordered the poisoning of Alexander out of fear that Alexander would eliminate him in time. These fears were perhaps justified. Shortly before his death, Alexander had dispatched a small army to Greece under the command of Craterus. with most scholars agreeing that Craterus was sent to relieve Antipater of power. Before he could be removed, however, Antipater secretly sent orders to Iollas to poison the king. Being the cupbearer, it would have been an easy crime. Later events lend some support to this theory. After Alexander's death, Antipater did not willingly submit to the designated heir, Perdiccas, and led a coalition against him. After Perdiccas' death in 321 BCE, Antipater was effectively the head of the empire until his own death a few years later. Amid the chaotic wars of the successors, Antipater's son Cassander showed an ambition for power and briefly ruled Macedonia himself. Cassander also ordered the execution of Alexander's young son, Alexander IV, in 309 BCE, before the young heir could be old enough to inherit his father's power. Plutarch reports that Cassander was deathly afraid of Alexander, even in death, and would panic when he merely saw a statue of the man. Was this fear one that masked guilt for his role in killing the great conqueror? If not Cassander, then Iollas is another obvious culprit, and Alexander's own mother agrees. Iollas died around 320 BCE, but after his death, Olympias accused Iollas of poisoning her son and had Iollas's body exhumed and desecrated. This might have been a political move to target Antipater's faction amidst the wars of the successors, or it could be a mother's sincere belief in punishing the man who murdered her son. Antipater and his family are probably candidates, but far from the only ones. Perdiccas, who became Alexander's actual successor, obviously profited from his death and would be a natural suspect. However, no sources accuse him of the crime, and none of his many enemies ever accuse him either. Another suspect was Alexander's wife, Roxanne. Graham Phillips noted that the rare strychnine poison was native to her homeland of Bactria, and the young woman chose to dispose of the man who'd forced her into marriage and subjugated her kingdom. As with Perdiccas, there is no contemporary evidence of this, and is based purely on speculation. Any number of ambitious nobles in court could have killed Alexander, perhaps hoping to rise to the top in the inevitable scramble for succession. Members of the Persian elite could also have wanted to avenge their fallen empire by eliminating its destroyer. Even the Greeks resented Alexander's dominance and launched a rebellion shortly after his death, adding to the already formidable list of suspects. The truth is that we do not have the evidence to assert that Alexander was poisoned. It remains a tempting possibility, a favorite for historical fiction and sensational headlines, but just one theory among many. Consistent among every account is that Alexander's illness appeared during or shortly after a night of intense drinking with his friends. It is natural to ask whether alcohol had anything to do with his demise. Alexander's contemporaries would have been well aware of alcohol poisoning and its symptoms, but none of the sources suggest that is what killed him. The protracted nature of Alexander's illness is also inconsistent with alcohol poisoning, as is the absence of vomiting, which is a distinct sign of alcohol poisoning. It is possible that alcohol exacerbated, but was not the root cause of an underlying illness. One theory is that Alexander was killed by acute necrotizing pancreatitis exacerbated by heavy alcohol consumption. This is when tissue from the pancreas starts to die and potentially causes a fatal septic infection in the bloodstream. Sudden intense abdominal pain is consistent with this diagnosis. The gradually escalating fever aligns with a worsening infection caused by the necrotizing organ. Late-stage infections can also cause the loss of speech and motor functions, consistent with the accounts of Alexander's death, due to swelling of the brain. This theory was first proposed in 1997 and has enjoyed support from a number of other historians and medical professionals. There are no obvious incompatibilities with any of the accounts of Alexander's death, but it would also be unreasonable to assert that such a rare ailment was definitely the cause of his death, when other explanations are plausible too. Other scholars have proposed infectious disease as the cause of Alexander's untimely death. Stress from the recent Indian campaign, the loss of his Hephaestion, and the accumulated stress of years of military campaigns could have weakened Alexander's immune system and made him vulnerable to any number of illnesses. 3 candidates deserve special attention on this front. Some suggested that the omen of dying birds was no fictional construct, but evidence of the disease's presence in Babylon at the time of Alexander's death. Birds act as hosts for the West Nile virus, and, similar to how the mass death of rodents can anticipate an outbreak of the Black Death, the mass death of birds preceded an outbreak of the West Nile virus in Babylon. Alexander could have been infected by a mosquito which picked up the disease from one of the birds, which resulted in his death. Intriguing as this theory is, Alexander's symptoms do not indicate West Nile virus. Fever is the only significant symptom shared between a typical West Nile virus infection and Alexander's illness. Early West Nile virus infections produced delirium and confusion that was not apparent in Alexander's case, and paralysis, or comes as seen in Alexander's last days, is extremely rare, even in fatal cases of West Nile virus. The other candidate is, of course, malaria. Arguably the biggest killer of human beings in history, malaria is almost always a reasonable suspect in any unexplained death in its endemic areas. Malaria was endemic to Mesopotamia. The Euphrates River that ran through Babylon, in which Alexander would have bathed countless times, must have been infested with these malaria-carrying insects. It's also plausible that Alexander was infected at some point in his years-long conquest and faced a sudden fatal relapse at Babylon. Alexander's worsening fever is a good fit for a malaria diagnosis. Severe cases of malaria can produce neurological conditions that fit Alexander's loss of bodily functions and could have sent him into a coma before he died. Both diseases would leave Alexander's abdominal pain unexplained, however, and another candidate offers a stronger explanation that accounts for all symptoms: typhoid fever. Typhoid fever is caused by a bacterial infection usually acquired from contaminated food or drinking water. It has been a common ailment throughout history and was almost ubiquitous around the world in the pre-industrial age. David Oldach was the first to argue that Alexander's worsening fever with abdominal pain and eventual loss of key bodily functions, perhaps due to encephalitis, were indicative of a fatal typhoid infection. Oldach pointed out that serious typhoid infections can cause a ruptured bowel, which could explain the sudden onset of severe abdominal pain that our sources record. A counterargument for the typhoid diagnosis is that a perforated bowel typically occurs very late in the infection, not at the start. Regardless of the cause of his death, history ranks him as one of the greatest of all military commanders, and he remains the touchstone by which those who embrace the profession of arms measure all things. His 3 strange wishes. The ancient Egyptians in the BC era induced many bodies to become preserved in mummified states, thinking the preservation of the body would ensure the safekeeping of the physical self and the soul for the world after. Organs were safely stored in canopic jars to conserve the viscera in futile pursuits, to protect them from dying and losing their physical purpose. Intricate gold necklaces, embezzled gemmed stones, and baroque items intended for kings and queens were placed next to coffins. Extraordinary and uniquely considerable measures were taken to create pathways between this world and the hereafter, where the Egyptians could bring their life and their worldly possessions to the new life after, evidently all in vain. Death is a concept that is inevitable and inflexible, much to the contradiction of what most ancient civilizations believed was possible. Many rulers from the ancient world often surrounded themselves with the highest and most valuable of items and expected to be buried with ornate materialistic items to highlight their importance and divinity. Alexander the Great, too, earned much wealth, and like most leaders was expected to be buried with vast relics of his travels and journey to draw attention to his victorious achievements and greatness. However, in his final days, The great leader who ruled over the ancient world requested 3 wishes he asked to be fulfilled upon his demise. Only his physicians carry his dead body. The path leading to his grave be ornate with precious metals and gems. Both his hands be open and kept dangling out of his coffin. When the generals asked Alexander the Great about these strange requests, the ruler replied that he wanted to show that by making physicians carry his dead body, people understood that no doctor could beat death. He desired the pathway to his grave to be ornate with treasures, to show people that although he spent most of his life chasing the riches of the world, he had to leave them all behind. And thirdly, he wanted both his hands open and out of the coffin to show he would be leaving this world empty-handed, just as he was born. In essence, it is important to understand that the main idea of these requests from this great conqueror was that, although he had achieved an incredible amount of success on earth, he was subject to mortal life, and his worldly achievements would do him no good in the life after death. It is the nature of humans to be greedy and uncontented with material possessions. Man chases wealth and immortality all his life, but when death arrives, in distress, he begs for another chance to go back and do things differently than he had. This is the nature of man. Only those who understand the true meaning behind life and what will matter in the end are content with passing on to the next life in peace.